Welcome everyone. You're listening to the ICCA India podcast. Through the podcast series, we hope to bring out multidisciplinary dialogues by discussing the intersections of economics, policy, and cancer.
Welcome everyone. This is the next session of the Innovations for Cancer Care in Africa project podcast. We are podcasting in order to get a much wider conversation going, to have a chance to speak with really interesting people working on cancer and other types of pressing social issues. Today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Dr. Satya Dash, who has a huge set of experiences that we would like to dive into. It's also a chance for us to think about the nature of our own project and the way we do our research. Our focus in the ICCA project is on 4 countries, the UK, India, Kenya, and Tanzania. What we are very interested in ensuring is that we really have a detailed conversation about what innovation means, where it comes from, how we might do it better, and how countries are changing with time. So welcome, Dr. Dash.
I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And Ojasvi Ghai is also with us today. She's a member of our own team. And I wondered if I could kick off today's conversation, Satya, by asking you to introduce yourself to this audience.
My basic training is scientist, but what really keeps me going is igniting entrepreneurial fires, designing innovation ecosystems. And I've been fortunate to be part of founding teams of some amazing organizations, especially BIRAC, where I was the head of strategy, the founding head of strategy. And I've been also part of PATH and industry bodies like ABLE. My basic training was in the UK, where I gained my master's and PhD, and then moved to India in 2010. Currently, I live in Berlin, and I advise many startups and organizations globally.
So that was the short, pithy version of a very, very rich career. So I wondered if you could educate this audience a little bit about what BIRAC is, because in the Indian space, it really was something very unusual.
BIRAC came into being in 2012 as a non-profit public sector unit under the aegis of Department of Biotechnology. But the idea of BIRAC was possibly seeded a couple of years before that within the Department of Biotechnology by the then Secretary, Dr. M.K. Bhan. And it was thought about how do we really bridge the gap of biotech stroke medtech innovation in the country. And there was a huge gaping hole in the country at that time in terms of translating biotech medtech ideas into society, into the market, into the doorstep of people. And that was what was thought about. How do you do it in a unique way that's the role of the government is there, but there is also an arm's length governance system. And that's how BIRAC was set up as a non-profit agency in 2012. And in the almost close to 10 years now, it has created a whole ecosystem in India that looks into innovation funding of biotech and medtech ideas coming out from across India.
You, of course, were quite a traditional scientist for your PhD work. Did you always feel this itch to go into something which seemed like an inevitable next step, or was there some other thinking behind it?
You know, Smita, we all have zigzag careers. I grew up in a very tiny place in east of India in Odisha, called Sambalpur, by the fact that my father chose to be a professor in Sambalpur University after gaining his PhD from Canada. He came straight to Sambalpur. Sometimes pathways are that you see what others are doing. So I did biology and I did a master's in India in Sambalpur and then went to the UK, did a master's in molecular genetics, then traveled across Germany and Canada, coming back to East Anglia, University of East Anglia to do a PhD. But all through, I think I was interested in reading Economist, let me say it that way. And it kind of evolved into a place where I felt, how do technologies interact with society? I was getting increasingly interested in ethics of new technology and policy issues. I was nudged to taking a policy career. So after PhD, I did a short postdoc in King's College London, but then eventually came to Cambridge to do a technology policy master's. And interestingly, I started working with the manufacturing department of University of Cambridge called IFM, Institute for Manufacturing. It's a fabulous place. So on one hand, I was with Judge Business School. On the other, I was working with the manufacturing department. And that kind of gave me a plethora of experiences that I kind of absorbed. And one serendipity led to other, where there was a project that I was working with Tim Minshall and David Gill that took me to India. I met Professor Vijay Chandru and Kiran Majumdar-Shaw, who were at that time also building ABLE, which is the association, and they were looking for a chief operating officer for ABLE. And here I was talking to them on an unrelated meeting, and I got an offer at the end of the meeting from Vijay, and then I decided to move back to India in 2010. ABLE was the knowledge partner of BIRAC at that time. As I said, BIRAC was being thought through, was being seeded by Dr. Bhan, and he had reached out to different stakeholders, and ABLE was knowledge partner. So what that meant was I started interacting with Dr. Bhan and BIRAC at that time. And one thing led to other, and after ABLE, I then joined BIRAC. That's how the career started into policy. And once I joined BIRAC, we kind of designed, it was early days of BIRAC. So the founding head of strategy and partnerships and entrepreneurship development, there was a lot of activity. BIRAC was a government startup. I took it as a government startup. So like any startup, there's a lot of activity, a lot of vibrancy, a lot of energy. And we worked collectively, and we kind of designed, implemented close to 17 programs in the first 5 years. And in starting from early stage innovation grant, one of the biggest one is the BIG, BIG it is called, social innovation funding called SPERSH, to sustainability, SOCH, to regional centers. I was also the in-charge head of intellectual property IP vertical of BIRAC. So we designed IP support mechanism called BIRAC Path. And then we kind of transitioned to increasing the footprint of BIRAC, set up regional centers, and then also designed the equity programs of BIRAC, the BIRAC Seed and the ACE funds. And that was the first 5 years. And there was an itch to move on and look into new avenues of what's happening. And I wanted to really peek into how is the global health structured? What is happening there? How do technologies really interface with society? Because, one thing is development of product, but other thing is implementation of and adoption of it. And that took me to spend a couple of years with an international organization called PATH, which is headquartered in Seattle. So I worked with PATH India and set the innovation vertical for PATH India in India, where we kind of took a cohort of 10 public health products and tried to accelerate them towards the market through the validation stages. And that gave me an immense opportunity to understand what really happens once the proof of concept is ready and entrepreneurs are moving it towards the market. After that, we decided as a family unit to park ourselves in a couple of years in Germany. And so we came to Germany, and none of us knew that we were going to hit a turbulence called the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So we had to stop in our tracks, like all of us. But it has given us, all of us, hopefully, is some time for introspection, time with family, but still carry on work. So in the last 2 years that I've been in Berlin, I have worked as a consultant advisor to Nesta, a Longitude Prize, which is in antimicrobial resistance for a year. That exposed me to almost a dozen or more of global AMR diagnostic companies and seeing what their challenges are and how they are building rapid diagnostics for AMR. Using at least a half a dozen to a dozen startups. Some of them are in India, but are moving to the US. Some of them are in India, also moving to Ireland. All this is a mixture of panoply of experiences that has happened in the last 2 years. It's crunching the last 20 years in the last 5 minutes.
I just want to dwell on a couple of the points you raised, which I think are really important. You, for example, have an extraordinary reach and understanding of a pivotal period in India's recent history, where we are going through major grappling with regulatory changes, questions of how to deal with issues of market design that before were all boxed into maybe one model or a limited set of models. And now there are more both opportunities on the technology front, but also challenges on how to think about regulation, market design, new opportunities for firms, and so on. So you've covered quite a lot of ground. So I wondered whether we could take this and ask a little bit, given that perspective, given how critical and quite nuanced your path has been here, how do you think about innovation? It's a horribly overused word, but you have your own perspective and your own take on this. What's innovation to you? What does it mean?
The way I look at it from the perspective of the last 15 years of work that I've done is, I think innovation is anything that has the power to make our lives better and that brings value to the lives of the user. Earlier, if you had asked me this question 10 years back, I would have given you a very technologically focused answer on innovation. But increasingly, I'm thinking that innovation can also be, how do you design open museums for communities? And so that people feel rooted, they have a lens to look at their own history, they have a lens to look at the world, and also connected to the global humanity on the other. So even that is innovation to me. The traditional definition that it is a product or it's a process that is used by society, I think it's also intangible things like creative arts in society, right? And how do you innovate in that? So for me, that is the definition. That really has the power to make our lives better. But the twin brother or the twin sister of innovation is translation. So in some way, innovation, the word itself has translation inherent in it, in a sense that you may have a new idea of how do you design a new product or how do you create a new range of street in a local community, how do you bring creative arts into the community, how do you solve a problem. But the implementation part of that new idea is part and parcel of the innovation process. And translation, therefore, is the pathway for realization of the value that the innovation that you have thought about. Let me also step back. I think one of the things about innovation is, because I said it has the power to make our lives better, that inherently means there are challenges. And these challenges can pertain to our health, our environment, and health can have mental health, physical health, and all of that. So innovators are some people who have the bug in them to try to create this solution for the customer. Okay, let me use the word customer here. And it's important to differentiate intermediate buyers, the customers, and then users, and finally the beneficiaries. And unless we map them, who is getting what value out of that innovation and understand that, the policy arm of the government has to look as well as the innovator has to look as well. Because the government role in innovation is necessary, but maybe also could become limiting sometime. It is important to see where the innovation is coming out from, who it is meant for, who is deriving value out of it, what are the outcomes of those innovations. So if you're saying that it has the power to make our lives better, how do you define better? What are the frameworks of using the word better so that we have a tangible data set that we can then say, yes, this is how this innovation has made our lives better.
This has been an interesting conversation, and it is important also to focus on implementation and adoption. And there comes the point of accessibility as well, that when some
creative idea or a product is invented, then how can it become more accessible and more affordable for the masses and people in the community itself?
Now, first thing is any innovation that tries to bring and solve problems, especially in the context of Indian market, and taking into account what our healthcare system has been in the last many decades, right? It was really to bring affordable products to the market. But affordability is not to be equated to being cheap or not excellent. Conundrum to be solved for India and for India-like geographies across the world, I may say, and also increasingly in the developed markets as well, as their healthcare budgets are going over the roof, is how do you build high quality, affordable products that are excellent and that solve the problem in a sustainable way. Affordability itself can mean that the product itself is affordable, and that could be because of the cost of labor and everything else. But it means that there could be interventions by the government to make the product affordable. Generally when we say affordable, we think the product is cheap. But actually, it's not always true. If the government also intervenes and uses taxes or import duties and all of that, it can, or even subsidizes it through insurance, then it can become affordable, right? And for a country like India, I think access is very important, but affordability does allow for access, but it's not always the case that affordable products can be accessed easily, because there are many other barriers to access that could be there. So if you have a cervical cancer screening product, which might be affordable, but it may not be adopted because the way the society is structured, the way the society norms have structured, it may not be possible for that solution to go deeper into the society. And the third thing is access doesn't always equate to being correlated to having an affordable product. It has layers of social dynamics that the product has to overcome. And finally, the product has to be excellent, because when I use the word excellent, I mean that the dignity of the patient is the highest. The safety of the patient is the primary, is the center point for every product that is being designed, right? And that mindset also has to come, that we cannot do jugaad. Right? I mean, for me, jugaad has deep negative connotation. Actually, it evolves out of rent-seeking entity and that mindset. You can achieve things through shortcuts. And I think we, as a country, we should go beyond that. And I say this because I think if anywhere in the world we can crack the conundrum of affordability, access, and excellence, it is India. We have amazing creativity, we have amazing talent, and I think we can design products and processes that can really make it affordable and accessible for products for our communities.
I actually do want to build on that a little bit, because I think, there has been an understanding that somehow guard or some kind of bricolage, it might be a short-term solution, but it doesn't actually build the systems you need to kind of push towards an aspirational quality. Whether it's a market mechanism or a non-market mechanism, the world is your oyster if you really think about people who are creative problem solvers. So could you talk about what is it about, whether it's jugaad or other kind of innovation ideas, what is it that you are uncomfortable with?
You rightly said, and I agree completely, and I absolutely endorse that. Jugaad by itself means there is a systemic failure somewhere. So if there is a systemic failure because of, say, for example, there's the governance failure, therefore, your roads are not being properly built and you are having potholes after every rain, and you start, covering those potholes with some material that you find in your neighborhood, right? So that your two-wheeler can go okay in your neighborhood. Now, that is a systemic problem. Should we celebrate the ingenuity, the creativity? Of course we should. But to say that that is the solution is somehow defeating the purpose. Somehow not really looking at what the real problem is, which is that the roads are not being built properly and there is some corruption happening somewhere. So to me, that itself is jugaad. Tinkering and bricolage in the product development process, including when you are building excellent product. The early stage of product development does involve a lot of bricolage and tinkering and, putting together things that were not meant to be put together. Then you see new things coming out. Now, that is part and parcel of any product development, right? I mean, it's almost like when you're even writing a short essay or a short story or even a book, you start with a few lines and then you come back. And so you're bricolaging, you're tinkering, you're putting ideas. And same thing when it is with other products, whether it is in medtech or healthcare or automobile or anything, right? But as the product goes beyond certain check gates, the ability to do bricolage and tinkering goes down because, the product has started to adhere to a pathway of quality of certain things that it needs to show that it is technologically working. At the back end of product development, these things are used by innovators when they're trying out new things. As a word, jugaad, to really paper over systemic problems that lie in our country or globally, and to use that as a word for celebration is something that I don't agree with.
But there is an issue with implementation, right? So you could argue that the point of jugaad was that recognizing a systemic failure of some kind, this is a short-term solution. Of course, it begs the question of, well, where do we go next? Now that we have recognized the person who filled the pothole or devised some other solution, do we have a way of pulling them into some longer-term system building? Of course, the difficulty is that if you had this kind of combination of institutions that railed against fixing the pothole in the first place, if we went with that example, chances are they would absolutely not be rewarding the people, or they would reward only under some conditions the people who fill the potholes, right? So they would have to pull them in with the existing system and reward them as opposed to changing the rules. So there's a kind of co-option question there, which is quite interesting that you've got me thinking about now.
So I think you make a very valid point, Smita. Those who are attempting to do jugaad as those who are giving, trying to solve a problem with the resources that they have, right? And they may be very limited resources, correct? What it really tells you that, the creativity and ingenuity in our community across the world is there. And how do we then co-opt them? And maybe there is something in that idea that can be refined and built to excellent standards that can be also looked into. Or because they have that entrepreneurial bug to solve problems, can we create a community of them to really think about solutions, but from a more systemic, from a more excellent, using a prism of excellence. Third thing is, jugaad by the very definition, it's so contextual that it's not scalable. So therefore, I'm all for creativity, ingenuity, all of that, but I would rather think more sustainably in terms of new products and processes that we are designing that do not have shortcuts. So as long as there is no shortcut in anything that we are designing that is going to be used by people, I'm okay with that.
Are we doing some things much better now in India? 20 years from the time that we first kind of launched some of this interesting institutional innovation, if you like, to now, are there some phases or aspects of the process that as a society we are getting a little bit better at?
I think we started the conversation about definition of innovation. The fact that it has become part of a collective discourse in India in the last 15, 20 years is itself a step change. So, and good thing is that we're talking about Swachh Bharat on one side, thankfully, and we're talking about innovation in Swachh Bharat, right? So I think this is a fabulous point for me that, finally we are talking about problems that are sticky problems for us for the last several decades. But we are looking at the problem and saying, can we find solutions that we can design and deliver to excellent standards, right? And the problem could be sanitation, The problem could be cancer care. The fact that, 15, 20 years back, if you were to say, okay, name me a couple of innovations for cancer care, and cancer care could be, diagnosis or detection, or it also could be therapeutics. I'll just focus, on the diagnostic part. Even there, it would have been difficult to find really globally excellent but affordable products out of India. But now, if you look at it, and we touched upon cervical cancer, right? I mean, there are now amazing startups that are not just at the ideation stage, but they are in the market now. And you look in, and there's a company called Periwinkle that does smart scope, and Veena Muktali and Kaustubh Naik have built it, and they've taken it to the market. If you look at really top-end tumor ablation, there are companies like Perfint, which you might have heard. They're from Chennai and started by Nandakumar, and they are really top-end devices that can go in and help the surgeons to really, ablate a tumor out. And this is, globally based. It has gotten its 510K FDA approval, and it's really built out of our, geography itself, right? And the third thing is you say, okay, in terms of really new technologies as well, like Perfint is using, in detection, there is a term that we use called liquid biopsy. So you're looking at circulating tumor cells. And again, there is a company in Pune called Actorius, co-founded by a couple of people. Jayant Khandare is one. And they can really look at these circulating tumor cells that can give you an indication whether the tumor has become metastatic and all of that. These are amazing technologies. And again, this has come out of India. It is approved in India and by CDSCO. And the cost of detecting the circulating tumor is really down. Here are 4 solutions that were possibly not there 12 years back. And each of these has meant taking the idea through the hoops and hurdles and bringing it to the market. It shows the change that has happened in India in the last 15 years.
On the one hand, there's this grid, right? There's this kind of fabric getting pulled together, different pieces in different parts of the country. A lot of it has been public sector led, which is also often forgotten. There is a big role for government here, maybe more agile government, maybe kind of a regulatory apparatus that has to be fairly flexible, but also the moving parts of these incubators perhaps now coming to fruition is also perhaps to set aside, if I could say, a certain cynicism about the roles of government in history. It is important. It takes time for a lot of planning and policy to actually come to bear. Sometimes the long scope is needed. Do you think this timeline and scale question, just in terms of sheer numbers, is that something that people are, whether it's India or a lot of other countries, that perhaps the scale of this has to be really understood as well?
Let's step back and say that as a country, where are we in terms of our position on the table of global innovation? Are we doing enough? Have we done enough? And what we should be doing next in the scale question, right? And what is the role of the government in all of that? First thing is, we have kind of reaching a critical mass of innovators, right? That needed to be first seeded, right? And that seeding stage, the role of government is there. So I think the role of government is important in each of these stages, but intervention mechanisms has to change. And different agencies have to come together of the government to kind of create that optimal mix. If you look at what we have done in the last 15 years, the early stage intervention by the government in designing institutions that take care of the early stage, seeding stage of innovation, some parts of that have been done well, especially the innovation grant mechanism and also the early stage push systems are okay. Now there are other sets of government agencies that need to play a role, and how integrative that role should be, how hands-off they should be, what kind of decisions, transparency that it should be there. As Mariana Mazzucato said in her book, if you unpick the iPhone and you say, okay, this is a great entrepreneur who made Apple, and then you look into the iPhone and you start seeing that, the imprint of the government intervention is there for a product that is celebrated as one of the most epitome design product of the world. And that's what it tells you how government role is suffused in all innovation. I personally feel that we have to contextually design our ecosystem that takes into account our hard realities, right? And learn from others. The government has to decide how far it needs to go in, where it's to let go of, right? And here I think the word bricolage would be wonderful, because, you bring in different actors, the actor network theory, and then you say, okay, let serendipity happen between the actors. So you have created a few actors and let them now start interacting and new things emerge out of it. The third thing is the scale question. We don't want to be a land of prototypes, but we really want to be a land of impactful products, right? I mean, now we have lots of good prototypes, maybe some of them validated, some of them in the market, right, that have given us sense of achievement. But there are many more that are really at the gates of the market. How do we bring them to the other side? And that scale question is different problem to solve, because it could range from having our vendors for precision engineering components, batch manufacturing at scale, those vendors having global standards of ISO 13485 and others, and the network of supply chain. And again, we saw what we saw in COVID-19 times, right? How important it is to have secure supply chain for an emergency condition, but that's true for a normal manufacturing network of supply chain we have to see. And then finally, a robust private venture fund community. We have attempted to do it, but can you again learn and contextualize it for our country is something that we need to see. So those learnings have to be integrated quickly. But I think now we know we can do it. Have we done it in other sectors? Yeah, I mean, look at our automobile sector, right? We have been manufacturing now. We are a manufacturing hub for automobiles, which needs precision engineering and all of that. So can we look into that supply chain and see whether that some of parts of that can be learned or incorporated into our medtech supply chain issues, right? Where do we build our manufacturing hubs and testing facilities and validation facilities? Just not one thing will do for India, right? I mean, we have, say, an AMTZ in Andhra, but is that sufficient? Maybe not. Should we have more? The answer is yes.
There is an issue here, Satya, which I think you've raised very nicely. There really is a kind of a rethinking of higher ed here. And maybe not even higher education just as university, but something much earlier, where there's a different understanding of all the pathways where people with a good idea get out. You have to start a firm. That there may be an array of pathways where not everybody, after all, who's a scientist wants to be an entrepreneur. But this intermediate space right now is not very clearly defined. And it may be that, as people see different kinds of examples out there, you can fall back on the scale of diversified Indian industry to do a lot more. As you point out, whether it's automotive or whether it's electrical, whether it's cold storage, whether it's clean room technologies of different kinds, they are used in multiple industries. And it may also be that the health industry space is going to look very different 10 years out, feeding into a lot of other industries that right now perhaps the relationship is more peripheral. It's an exciting time, and you've given, I think, both us and our audience plenty to think about. So I really want to thank you, Satya. This was a great conversation, a chance, I hope, for our ICCA project series and other work where we look at technological change and innovation to build out into bigger conversations. I actually think it's a sign that our system is changing, because not just because of COVID, otherwise you and I, people like us who come from different disciplines and quite complementary perspectives, might not otherwise be speaking quite as frequently. So I think that's a sign of, 20 years ago, that might not have happened.
Exactly. That's a biomarker for change. Right. And that's true. One of the best experiences I had was in IFM, Institute for Manufacturing, as I said. It has manufacturing in it. The word is right there staring at you, part of School of Engineering in Cambridge. And, that's such a fantastic place. You meet design thinkers, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, all of them coming together with engineers and scientists, thinking about a certain problem and looking at it from different angles.
It's a wonderful time, I think, for all the young people listening into this podcast to be rolling up your sleeves and getting to work. I think in my generation, there were some reasons to complain. I think there are fewer reasons now. So you actually have a lower bar to get into this. I think it's exciting times ahead for cancer patients, for many people innovating in this area. And I think India has some useful perspective to offer other places, both struggles as well as successes. So thank you, Satya. A real pleasure to have you on, and we'll find a way to get you back on.
Thank you so much, Smita and Ojashvi. Lovely speaking to you. And my final comment would be, really, when you're bringing the sky is the limit for innovators in India and anywhere, hopefully we'll have much more elegant, compassionate, ecosystem.
Thank you for listening to the ICCA India podcast. Do follow our social media handles and stay tuned for the next episode.